Hi. Good afternoon. Thrilled to be here to talk about a great man who's in Houston today. And he would rather be here, I think, given the weather. But I wanted to tell you a quick story first. I worked on this book about President Bush for 13 years. It was supposed to be posthumous, but he won't die. So it makes it a little tricky. Yeah, it's good. We're glad he's still with us, but it's like, come on, sir. He used to say, you got to publish it when I'm paws up. So the key to doing a George H.W. Bush voice, by the way, is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. That's not going to do it. So this past March, and I'm sure this is a big holiday for you all. In Tennessee, it was a big deal. This was Andrew Jackson's 250th birthday. And so we had a bunch of duels at home about it. And I live in Nashville. And the president was coming down to the Hermitage, to Andrew Jackson's house, to lay a wreath on the grave and acknowledge the holiday. And I'm a Jackson biographer, and I was sitting there, and I was thinking, should I do something? So I decided to write an open letter to President Trump about Andrew Jackson, and saying that if you're going to embrace Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy. That Jackson was, in fact, understood his vices, he turned them into virtues, he was devoted to the American Union, he was a very careful political operator, and so I wrote this, and it ran in the entire front page of the local newspaper, ran it actually. It had no effect whatever, of course. But the next day, I was walking into lunch, and true story, my phone rang, and it was President Bush. And he'd been in the hospital, and so he had a lot of free time. And his staff had given him this piece I'd written. So I answer, and he says, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm fine, sir." What do you say to that? He said, I read your letter to Jackson. And I was like, the old boy's 93. Right, he's getting a little confused, he's losing a step. He can say that to me, but what if he says it to someone else? It'll look like he's, losing it. So I say, well, thank you, sir, I appreciate it. It's great to hear from you. Actually, it was to Trump about Jackson. And he said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention. So he's fine, if you're worried. He's totally fine. So, the other quick story is I was at the National Book Festival, which we think of as Rancho Mirage Light in Washington a couple years ago, and I was on my way to give my talk at that point about Jackson, and a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough, and said, "Oh my God, it's you!" And I said, "Yes." That's hard to argue with. She said, "Oh, I just love you so much. Will you wait right here? I want you to sign your new book." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I was thinking, this is exactly the way the world is supposed to be. Women are supposed to run up to you. They're supposed to want you to sign the books. This is great. And hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest. No. So whenever I think I have the world right where I want it, I remind myself that somewhere in America there's a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. So, but the next day, I was in the process of doing the book about the Bushes, and so I went up to Kennebunkport and was having lunch, and I told Mrs. Bush the story. And she looked across the table in that wonderful Barbara Bush way and said, "Well, how do you think poor John Grisham would feel? He's a very handsome man." So she's fine, too. I want to talk about President Bush. To some extent, the movement from George Herbert Walker Bush to the 45th president disproves Darwin, because we're supposed to be evolving. He is, I should say, the embodiment of an ethos of service and of national interest that, for all his failings and all his faults, and we'll talk about those, really means that I think he's a figure who has more in common with the founding fathers than he does with most people of his own generation, and certainly of our own time. He was born with a great privilege, but also the devoted principle that was drilled into him that he had to serve, that to serve was the price of that privilege. That in the words of the gospel, to whom much is given, much is expected. And that was driven into his head in Greenwich and in Maine all through his life. And it is a little bit like talking about the Peloponnesian Wars, to think about service in that way. But only 25 years ago, we had a president of the United States who did see the world in the way Dwight Eisenhower saw it, and in the way John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington saw it in many ways. And so I want to tell you two stories that I think created the man who embodied those virtues in our time. One starts on September 2nd, 1944. It was a sunny Saturday in the Pacific. He was flying a combat mission, Lieutenant Junior Grade George H.W. Bush, who had joined the Navy on his 18th birthday. Three things happened on June 12th, 1942. Bush turned 18, he graduated from Andover, and he drove to Boston and took an oath as a naval enlistee. He became the youngest flying officer in the Navy. He flew 58 combat missions, won the Distinguished Flying Cross. He wrote his first letter to a Gold Star family when he was 20 years old. So, again, it's without overdoing the comparison, it's worth thinking about. 2 years later, so in 44, he's flying off the San Jacinto aircraft carrier. He was a carrier-based pilot. He flew a combat mission over Chichijima, an island we later found out was the scene of horrific war crimes. He's going in to take out a radio tower that was a communication supply point back to the home islands. He is hit by fire. It was the heaviest fire he'd ever seen. The cockpit is filling with smoke. He sees the wings of the plane go up in flames, but he keeps going. He takes out the tower. He goes back out to sea. He has two crewmates with him, Del Delaney and Ted White. And the way the plane was built, it was a torpedo bomber, he had to talk to them through a radio because there was a steel steel wall behind him as the pilot. He tells them, he realizes the plane is going down. He tells them to bail out, hit the silk, as he put it. He moves the plane so they can do that. He then bails out. And at that point, the story almost ends because if you think about it, if you bail out of an airplane, the plane doesn't stop. So his head hits the back of the tail of the plane right here. So another 6-8 inches, he probably would have been decapitated. Plunges deep into the sea, comes up, he's throwing up. Providentially, his raft had landed near him. He flops on it. He looks around. He realizes the other two have probably not made it. There's no sign of them. There was a submarine, the USS Finback, that was on what was called lifeguard duty. They would go out and patrol to pick up flyers who were downed. And he was picked up, rescued, and the rest is history to some extent. At some point today, in Houston, in his 94th year, George Bush will think about Del Delaney and Ted White. He thinks about them every day. I asked him in the course of, again, 13 years of interviewing him for this, I said, what did you learn from the war? It's the kind of question people like me have to ask, and the question that people like him have to endure. And he said, I've always wondered, why was I spared? Why was I spared? I submit that in large measure, his entire public life, to some extent, has been an attempt to prove that he was worthy of being spared in a moment when other men were fated to die. And it has been a headlong pursuit of that mission since that moment. And when I say headlong, I mean it. In New Hampshire once in 1980, he shook the hand of a department store mannequin and asked for his vote. Now, Lyndon Johnson would have tried to register that mannequin, and God knows what Clinton might have done. So, at least there's that. He was always moving, always moving. The second moment was he heard the word leukemia for the first time In January of 1953, when he and Mrs. Bush had taken their daughter Robin, born in 1949. George W. had been born in 46. Robin was born in 49. She was 4. Jeb had just been born that month. When Mrs. Bush came home with Jeb from the hospital, Robin was bruising easily. She was tiring. They didn't know what was wrong with her. They took her. She was diagnosed, and they realized she had about 6 months to live. She died over the Columbus Day weekend in 1953. And that moment, which again somebody like me has to ask about, I said, what did you bring out of this experience? And he said, without hesitating, that life is fragile and it can be taken away at any point. And again, I think those two experiences, which are cataclysmic and fundamental and not widely shared, created in many ways the man who ultimately rose to the position of ultimate power and ultimate authority in a nuclear age. And so as we talk about him, just keep in mind that these are the two stories that are always unspooling in his head. We all have movies that unfold all the time, don't they? And for George Bush, it's about the most consequential of moments. They're about life and death. He's the last combat veteran to be president of the United States. He's the last president of the World War II generation, the first president of the post-Cold War generation. He's the last person who clearly put the national interest ahead of his political interest in a significant legislative moment, and it cost him dearly. He was, in many ways, a kind of canary in the coal mine for the politics of new media and for billionaires who used unconventional means to get their message out and to upend conventional politics. Ross Perot, to some extent, is the first verse of the hymn that ends where we are now. Bill Clinton understood cable television and the new world far better than President Bush did. Remember when Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall and played the saxophone? That was a big moment. George Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Yale. I mean, he had no idea, no clue. No. I took Spanish there. He had no idea what was going on. So to some extent, he was out of phase even in real time. So here's who this man is. He is born June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. He's the second child of Prescott Bush, future Connecticut United States Senator, and Dorothy Walker Bush, a daughter of St. Louis, of the great buccaneer G.H. Walker, who was a larger-than-life figure. They moved quickly to Greenwich. Bush was known as Poppy Bush because he was called Pop. It's a long WASP story I won't go into, but anyway, but Poppy is what he is. And in fact, to this day, though they claim not to, Mrs. Bush slips, the siblings slip and call him Pop or Poppy. He used to say, please stop, it's not going to work well in Iowa. So it was suppressed for a while. But he was, when he was coming along, he was known as half Bush, because he would take candy bars and cookies, cut them in half, and give half to the other kid. He had what his brother Jonathan called, when talking to me about it, an innate sense of empathy. And empathy is not a characteristic we talk about very much in terms of leadership, but I think it's absolutely vital. And here's a story that I think illustrates that. Bush went to Greenwich Country Day School, the hard, mean streets of Greenwich Country Day School. And the only time when his father disciplined him, it usually involved being hit with a squash racket. So that's like WASP child abuse, right? It's like hitting somebody with a martini pitcher. You know, it just doesn't quite get the sympathy going. But the only time actually that Prescott Bush, Senator Bush, really lost his temper with George H.W. Bush was he and his brother Prescott paid a neighborhood girl, Joni Williams. I don't know what happened to Joni Williams, and I'm sure she'd be horrified that I know her name. They paid her a dime to run naked through the house. And They were 6. And as Bush said, we wasted the money. We should have waited. So it's a true story. We were a little forehanded. So he's 12 years old, 13 years old. He's in his last year at Greenwich Country Day. He's going off to Andover. And he was the best athlete in the school, a remarkable athlete into his 80s. And he decided he was running the annual obstacle course race. And he always won the school obstacle course race. And so the faculty asked him in his last year before he went to Andover to give the other guys, give the whole school a head start. And then he would run afterward. And he said, fine. And so the school goes off, and then they hold him back. He starts off. And he's going through a series of barrels on the ground as part of the obstacle course. And he's coming out, and he looks to the right, and there's a fairly rotund lad named Bennett McNichol. Bennett McNichol is stuck in the barrel. And he has a moment. What do you do? Poppy Bush decides, I got to pull the kid out of the barrel. So he pulls him out of the barrel. He then realizes it would be ungentlemanly to beat someone that you just helped. And so they finish the race together. Biggest moment of Bennett McNichol's life. When I took that story to President Bush, I didn't hear it from a Bush. He said, Bennett, he loved lunch. Like, not the point, sir. He says, he's still big. I said, Mr. President, not the point. But and I asked him, we had very few moments like this in the course of doing it, but I said, why'd you pull him out of the barrel? And he really did. He looked at me as if I were an idiot. And he said, well, I had never been stuck in a barrel, but if I had been, I want somebody to pull me out, You moron. I mean, So he pulled him out of the barrel. Cut to November 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, the starkest symbol of a standoff over Armageddon. We had the capacity, still do, but in those days it was even closer, to destroy the world many times over. The wall falls. George H.W. Bush is President of the United States. He refuses to go to Berlin. He refuses to give a grand speech on the victory of freedom and the West over the forces of communism in the East. The press, the Democrats, George Mitchell, Dick Gephardt, others, are all pounding on Bush, saying he doesn't understand the poetry of history. Remember, shot down at the age of 20. He fully understood history and war and reality. He won't do it. He won't give that speech. He won't go to Berlin. Why? Because somebody else was stuck in a barrel, and that was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev had a hardcore right wing that did not want to see Soviet greatness go away, that did not want to see Russian greatness go away. And if you doubt me, I refer you to a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin, who was part of that movement. Bush knew that if he went to Berlin, he would complicate Gorbachev's life. And Gorbachev was headed in the right direction. Bush put himself in his shoes. He knew that if America had suffered a great defeat, the last thing he'd need was Mikhail Gorbachev, as Bush put it, sticking it in my ear, which I think he meant I, but that's all right. English was not always a friend. He won't do it. One of the critical moments at the end of the Cold War. Now, in doing this, George Bush didn't make that case to me. Jim Baker didn't make that case to me. Brent Scowcroft didn't. Mikhail Gorbachev did. Gorbachev said the two most significant moments at the end of the Cold War were his first summit with President Reagan in 1985 in Geneva, and the second was how George Bush handled the fall of the wall. So that's the best testimony you can get. His empathy had a direct effect on the stability and strength of the world in which we live. So if you wonder whether character matters, if you wonder whether character is significant in these matters, Heraclitus said it a long time ago. Character is destiny. The word destiny in Greek in that context can also be translated as fate. And so in many ways, George Bush's character affected all of our fates. Not perfect by any means. I want to talk about three moments where he did something wrong or expeditious in the search for power in order to be in power, and then, without fail, he did things against his self-interest while he had it. To me, the thing that redeems him the most is there is no great political life without compromise. There is no great life without compromise, it seems to me. But for him, he was an odd political fish anyway. He had gone to Texas after graduating from Yale in 1948, gone to Odessa. Mrs. Bush actually had been raised in Rye. Her mother was so convinced that Odessa was actually on the frontier that she would send boxes of soap and laundry detergent and toothpaste to her daughter because she didn't think they had it. The first house George Bush rented was a duplex. They shared the house with two women who were involved in a kind of Stormy Daniels-like profession, just to put it in context at the moment. And they shared a bathroom, which apparently President Bush was quite excited about, Mrs. Bush less so. This was kind of the, if you grew up in Rye and in Greenwich, to end up in Odessa, Texas, with two ladies of the night in the next duplex, it's like a student year abroad, right? But this was real life. He was in Texas, as he put it, with absolute unflinching candor because he wanted to make a lot of money quick. And he wanted to go into politics almost instantly. His first political job was he was on a publicity committee for Eisenhower for president in 1952 in Texas. As he put it, we could have met in a phone booth and had plenty of room before it unfolded. His father went in the Senate in 1950 as part of an unexpired term, was there for 12 years. Prescott Bush was, as President Bush used to say, tall, scary. Formidable figure, loved to sing, loved to listen to, in honor of our local geography, loved Fred Waring more than anything else, Prescott Bush did. And so Bush does a very good job in Texas. He's a pretty successful oil man. He's one of the first offshore drilling people in the Gulf, lost a couple of rigs in Hurricane Betsy, still remembered the bleakness he felt flying over the Gulf of Mexico and seeing that the rigs were gone, and feeling an immense amount of pressure to produce investment returns for those who had trusted him. When he was in his 30s, he collapses in a London hotel room from an ulcer that he believed was brought on by stress to produce that money for investors. He was always worrying, always fretting. So this wonderful facade he had of being a kind of Holden Caulfield with charm was, in fact, that. It was a facade in many ways. He thought deeply, he worried deeply, he felt deeply, and didn't want you to show it, didn't want you to know it. But he's impossible to understand politically if you don't think about the fact that he was the son of a Connecticut senator who'd gone to Greenwich Country Day and over Yale, but had staked his political fortunes in a medium rapid, changing Texas from a solid Democratic state to a solidly Republican one. He ran for the Senate in 1964. As he once put it, you might as well start at the top. He was not yet 40. He ran against a great populist named Ralph Yarborough. It was in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. One of the reasons Jack Kennedy was in Dallas in November of 1963 was because there was a division between the Ralph Yarborough wing of the Democratic Party and the John Connally, Lyndon Johnson one. And they were worried about it in part because there was this attractive potential Republican nominee named George Bush. And it wasn't crazy to think a Republican could win in Texas because John Tower had won Lyndon Johnson's seat in 1961. Johnson's head was filled with terror that two Republican senators would be coming from his home state. So one of the reasons for that trip to Texas, was to mend those fences and get things together. He lost that race in 64. He comes back. He runs for the House in 1966. He serves 4 years. Here's something that, again, is like talking about the Tudors. From 67 and 68, George Bush, as a congressman from the 7th District of Houston, voted with Lyndon Johnson, a Democratic president, 53.2% of the time. So I thought, I looked that up in Congressional Quarterly. I thought, well, that must have been a lot of ceremonial votes or something. I bet that second term in the House in 68, I mean in 69 and 70, with Nixon as president, that's going to be a lot higher. It was. It was 54.2. The idea that a congressman from Houston, Texas, would vote with a Democratic president more than half the time is like saying, okay, Mary Poppins is going to be in the Senate, and here's what's going to happen. It's just an unimaginable world. Inauguration Day, 1969, Richard Nixon finally becomes president. George Bush he'd been in the consideration briefly to become vice president in 68 as a very young congressman. He's flying people from Texas in. Mrs. Bush was horrified. They were running kind of an open hospitality shop at their house. They bought a house from Alan Simpson's father, Millard Simpson. They'd bought their house in Washington. And Mrs. Bush was horrified at one point that inauguration weekend to look out, and it was raining, and saw that the mayor of Houston was stuck in the bushes. And so it was just a crazy time. But what does Bush do an hour after Nixon's inauguration? He gets in a car, and he drives to Andrews Air Force Base to say goodbye to Lyndon Johnson, because he was a president from Texas. Bush wanted to pay respects to the office. He's the only Republican within 6 miles. Johnson is so surprised to see him that he thinks something might be wrong, and actually walks over and says, "George, what's going on?" He said, "I just wanted to say, hey, you know." Johnson never forgot it. Never forgot it. And there's something innate in that sense of courtesy, of a reverence for the office that transcends party and transcends the partisan considerations of a given moment. He loses in 1970, runs for the Senate, so he's lost twice. John Connally, one of the few people Bush never forgave. For a man in public life at that level for so long, he never forgave Ross Perot for obvious reasons. Not a big fan of Donald Rumsfeld. There are not a lot of birthday cards exchanged there. And John Connally. And the Connally conflict comes from Connally put a very attractive young fella, actually they couldn't quite tell him apart, named Lloyd Bentsen, into a Senate race to stop Bush from winning in 70. And Bush went into that race thinking he was going to have a rematch with Ralph Yarborough, thought he would win that. Almost certainly he would have. Over in Tennessee, in my home state, that same year, you had a young, attractive Republican named Bill Brock beat a Democratic populist named Al Gore Sr. So the South was changing in this year, but Benson was a complicating factor. Bush finds himself out of a job here at age 45. President Nixon, here's one of the little counterfactual moment that everything could have changed on this moment. My favorite one of these, parenthetically, is December 1932. Franklin Roosevelt is in Miami. He's on Vincent Astor's yacht. He comes ashore in Miami to give a little speech. An anarchist tries to assassinate him, shoots close enough with a .32 revolver that cost $8, by the way, an $8 revolver. He hit the mayor of Chicago, happened to be in the park, had walked up to say hello to Roosevelt. The mayor of Chicago is killed. They miss Roosevelt. And does anyone think that the 1930s would be the same if Franklin Roosevelt had died in December 1932? I don't think the John Nance Garner years would live quite as... Same month, Winston Churchill is hit by a car in New York. He steps out onto Fifth Avenue and he looks left instead of right because he thought he was in London. and I'm sure Johnny Walker had something to do with this as well. Uh, and he's hit and almost dies. Does anybody think the history of the 1930s would be the same if Winston Churchill had died in that month? I don't, and that's not just because I did not want to write a book called Clement and Wendell, but all politics is local. So for Bush, a moment like this is he goes in to see Nixon to get a job after the 1970 loss, and Nixon says, "Why don't you come work for Bob Haldeman?" I don't know what some of y'all probably did. Not a great moment in 1970 to actually get on board the Nixon White House, right? It'd be like jumping, like Titanic, wait, at Southampton as you jump on. He thinks, Bush says, great, happy to do it. Somebody had suggested that the United Nations would be a great fit for him. Because for George Bush, all of life was one long reunion mixer. He just loved people. He could not be alone. Mrs. Bush, had more hamburgers grilled, had more meals whipped up out of nothing than anyone. Lady Bird Johnson was like this. She had to do the same thing. So he thought the UN would be interesting. So he mentions the UN to Nixon and knew exactly how to pitch it to Nixon. He says, I could represent you up there to the elites. And this got Nixon thinking. Here's Nixon, the son of a grocer from Whittier, who's going to have George H.W. Bush, the son of a senator, representing him in the salons of the East Side. Nixon liked the sound of that. And so he calls him back in and says, I want you to go to New York. Without casting any aspersions on President Bush, I'm not sure anybody could have been in the Nixon White House for 2 or 3 years with that taping system and escaped unscathed. I just don't think it's possible. So that moment actually kept him outside the Nixon White House and enabled him to build this foreign policy career. He was asked by his old friend Lud Ashley, who was a friend from Yale and a congressman from Ohio, when he got the UN appointment. Forgive the language, but I'm a historian, so I just quote. Lud said, George, what the hell do you know about foreign policy? Actually, that's not exactly what he said, but it's close enough. And Bush said, give me 10 days. And he just did a crash course. The beginning of the great foreign policy president started at that moment. He really did. He became a serious student of it. But he had not been sitting around in the 1960s thinking about containment by any means. He's chairman of the RNC during Watergate, survives that, was prepared, tried to make the case for Nixon to resign at that last cabinet meeting on August 6, 1974. He's cut off as he makes the case. He's in the East Room. Again, it's sort of he's like Forrest Gump to some extent. He's everywhere. He's in the East Room when Nixon gives that fabled farewell speech to his staff. And in his diary that night, the future president said, what a strange man. He said, he's not convinced anyone loves him. I can't imagine living like that. Tells you a lot about both people. Goes off to China, comes back, does a year at the CIA, and then immediately begins running for president against the great force of modern politics, Ronald Reagan. Comes in second. It's a sign of how different the Republican Party was in those days, that someone like Bush would come in second to Reagan. There was still a strong, moderate force. The 1970s, here's a way of judging this. The 1976 Republican platform endorsed the ERA. 1980, it's a whole different world. As you may remember, President Reagan very much wanted your former neighbor, Gerald Ford, to come back and run for vice president with him. Again, history turning on a dime. Reagan introduces the subject in Detroit, at the Detroit Convention, to President and Mrs. Ford on Monday afternoon of the convention. Thursday's the acceptance speeches. They negotiate. Dr. Kissinger gets involved. Alan Greenspan's involved. They negotiate for about 60 hours. It finally falls apart. At 11:32 p.m. on the penultimate night of the 1980 Republican convention, Reagan says, "I guess I better call George Bush." Bush, at this point, thinks it's over. He's changed out of his suit. He's wearing a red polo shirt, khaki pants, and drinking a Stroh's. I hope he had several. When the call comes, they say, "Is Ambassador Bush there?" Governor Reagan would like to speak to him. Bush thinks this is the letdown call. Jim Baker, Mrs. Bush are in the room. He takes the phone. He's left-handed. He takes the phone and says, "Yes, yes." And then all of a sudden he goes, the history of the American presidency over the last 30 years was fundamentally changed in that moment. At 11:32, the night before it all went over. 12 years without the 41st president. As the 43rd president will tell you, there would have been no 43rd, George Bush 43. Almost impossible to imagine that George H.W. Bush, had he not been vice president, that he would have become president. Because of the nature of the Reagan team, if he had been blocked out of that, my bet is perhaps he would have ended up in the cabinet, but probably not. And he would have been back in Texas, incredibly bored. But that's where he would have been. But he spent 8 years at Reagan's side, obviously 4 incredibly consequential years as president, and then his son succeeded him. So that turned in that moment. And it's, to some extent, it's a testament to him and to Mrs. Bush, because the next morning, and one of the reasons for the resistance to calling him in the first place was that the Bushes don't remember this quite this way, but this is actually the way it happened. As you may remember, in 1980, George Bush would be pictured jogging at any moment, particularly in Iowa, particularly in New Hampshire, particularly in January. I don't know about you all if you spent much time there. Obviously not, because you're here. It's not warm, and you usually wear warm-ups. He was always wearing shorts and a T-shirt. What was the message? Message was, I'm 55 years old and I can run, and he's 69, and I'd be careful. And let me tell you who understood that subtle message. Nancy Davis Reagan, who understood everything. She was the NORAD of political, if there was a traffic cop who didn't like Ronnie, she had him on a list somewhere. May we all be loved as Mrs. Reagan loved Ronald Reagan. Parenthetically, I never met President Reagan, which is one of my great regrets. But I did get to know Mrs. Reagan a little bit. The only woman I know who would order a third of a Cobb salad for lunch and still not eat it. I mean, it was just incredible. It's like, move it around, And, and I eat the whole salad and not feel like, Bennett, in the barrel. But Senator Danforth, who's here, Father Danforth, and his father Danforth, role will appreciate this. One of the remarkable things about Ronald Reagan is he has managed to convince generations of ministers and theologians that Jesus said, "We shall be as a shining city on a hill." Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said, "city on a hill." Reagan's visual imagination turns it into a shining one. So much so that I've sat in churches and had ministers say, "as our Lord said." It's like that old Texas school board woman who said, if English is good enough for our Lord Jesus, it's good enough for me. Totally irrelevant. But I told Mrs. Reagan, I said, your husband may be the only person I know who's improved on the Son of Man. And she looked at me and said, "Well, yes, that's the kind of thing Ronnie did." So I went home and I said, "Sweetheart, I've been married a long time." I said, "I don't think you love me as much as Mrs. Reagan." And she said, "Well, Reagan was a good-looking guy." So there's a theme. There's an insulting theme here. Quickly on the various compromises. George Bush is not a perfect man. As you can see, I admire him enormously. Spent a lot of time. He gave me his diaries. Mrs. Bush gave me her diary. She's kept one since 1948 forward every day. When George W. Bush heard that Mrs. Bush had given me her diary, he said, "She gave you what?" Yeah, that is not good news for me. Um, Mom and I didn't always get along. Um, it's a true story. He was terrified by that. He was so disappointed recently. He found out that he didn't actually say strategery. The Saturday Night Live people came down, and he said, "I made things easy for y'all." And they said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I said strategery, and I gave you that joke." And they said, "Mr. President, we made that up." And he was crushed. But then he did say, "Yeah, but I gave you misunderestimated." Um, so they gave me an enormous amount of material that no one asked for any writer review at all. Mrs. Bush asked me, because there was so much family stuff in the diary, that anything I quoted from the diary she had to see, not what I was going to say about it, but those words. I took her 80 pages of excerpts, and she took nothing off the record. It's a remarkable level of confidence in history's judgment. I can promise you, no presidential family does that by any means. But he's not perfect. And he believed, the reason I have destiny and the power, is he believed he was destined to be president. He believed that the world was going to be better off in his hands. And therefore, if he had to win, somebody had to lose, that was fine. So, three things. In 1964, when he ran that race in Texas, he opposes the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's a hard thing to talk about now because it's seen as American scripture, but he did. But what does he do when he gets in power in the House? He votes for open housing in 1968, putting his seat at risk. He has a huge meeting in Houston where he has angry constituents using words they shouldn't have used then and we certainly can't use now. We didn't send you up there to help those people. But he quoted Edmund Burke, saying that sometimes a representative owes you not a reflection of your will, but his best judgment. And my best judgment is that you cannot ask men to go to Vietnam and fight for freedom and not extend that freedom at home. And was reelected. So he trimmed his sails to win, but then he did the right thing. 1980, as you all remember, was not exactly a model campaign. It was rough. He echoed McCarthy in calling Governor Dukakis a card-carrying member of the ACLU. Fought about the Pledge of Allegiance, fought over a lot of cultural issues that did not have great endurance beyond that moment. But what does he do when he gets in? He and Mrs. Bush created really the last great moment where the White House was used as a tool of civility and comedy. They used the bowling alley, they used the horseshoe pit, they used Camp David, they used everything. The Americans with Disabilities Act, an unimaginable piece of legislation, by the way, for the current Republican Party, or current Republican president to sign. Unimaginable. The deal on that was cut when he and Tom Harkin, Democrat of Iowa, were having drinks and popcorn upstairs talking about being pilots in the Pacific. That's how they got through a key hurdle. He understood that this morning's enemy could be this afternoon's ally and vice versa. That politics could not be a zero-sum game. It could not always be total war. And he understood that civility and relationships mattered enormously. The first word he said as president was, "Hey, Danny." He saw Rostenkowski, the great Illinois legislator, and his speechwriters used to, because they'd write these great openings, and he'd always get up and just recognize people, like, "Hey, how you doing?" But what's fitting about the fact that he says, "Hey, Danny," as his first words of his inaugural address, is that it was because he said, "Hey, Danny," that he was taking that oath. He had the world's largest Christmas card list. He had no natural political base. It was simply a personal conviction that this is a man we could trust with our fates. And that's why he became president. The third is the tax question, which is, of course, famous. He moved sharply to the right to win in 1988. The right wing had been skeptical of him for a long time, but particularly for challenging Reagan in 80. He says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." 1990, he realizes that it's a wiser decision to raise some taxes. Actually, the initial deal didn't even raise marginal rates. It was only after a rebellion that unfolded. And he realizes, he says in his diary that night, and again, listening to his diary, which was tape recorded, is like listening to if Dana Carvey had been president, you know. He says, you know, I may have just lost re-election, but I have to do what's right. And so he did it with the full consciousness that this was possibly the end. I want to leave you with this as a sign of sort of what I believe we've lost. This is a segment from a letter that he wrote to his mother about Robin, who of course died in October of 53. This was written in the late 50s, right before Doro was born. The four boys were there. Doro has not yet been born. This is George Bush to his mother, Dorothy Walker Bush. There is about our house a need, the running, pulsating restlessness of the four boys as they struggle to learn and grow. The world embraces them. All this wonder needs a counterpart. We need some starched, crisp frocks to go with all our torn-kneed blue jeans and helmets. We need some soft blonde hair to offset those crew cuts. We need a dollhouse to stand firm against our forts and rackets and 1,000 baseball cards. We need a legitimate Christmas angel, one who doesn't have cuffs beneath the dress. We need someone who's afraid of frogs. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once. She'd fight and cry and play and make her way just like all the rest. But there was about her a certain softness. She was patient. Her hugs were just a little less wiggly. Like them, she'd climb in to sleep with me, but somehow she'd fit. She'd stand beside our bed until I felt her there. Silently and comfortable, she'd put those precious fragrant locks against my chest and fall asleep. My daddy had a caress, a certain ownership, which touched a slightly different spot than the "Hi, Dad" I love so much. In the course of interviewing the president for that, I asked him to read that out loud for me. And long before he finished, he broke down with an extraordinary level of physical sobbing, so much so that his chief of staff, whose office was next door, came in and saw what I was doing and said, "Why did you want President Bush to read that?" And I said, well, if you want to know someone's heart, and before I could finish, the president jumped in and said, you have to know what breaks it. Thank you very much.